Hello, welcome. I'm Brad Strabig, and we're going to be discussing sustainability in engineering. Today we're going to be looking at some information from the Rio de Janeiro First Earth Day International Summit held in 1992 and how things have changed in 20-year span of time until about 2012. Much of the information in this lecture can be found in the report Keeping Track of Our Changing Environment by the United Nations Environmental Program. What do some things look like in 2012 compared to 1992? Obviously, computers have changed. Social media has changed. The way we communicate, the way we interact, the way we use energy, as well as the number of people on the planet. These things have all changed tremendously in the last 20 years. And that rate of change is very important in how we define and interpret sustainability. If we look at things that have become more popular in terms of terminology that it's searched on the web, recycling, sustainability, the word itself, but also key concepts in sustainability like climate change, global warming, renewable energy, have all been talked about more and more frequently. As we go through Chapter 1, I'd like you to keep in mind a few overarching questions. 1. How many planets would be required for everyone on Earth to enjoy the type of lifestyle that you have grown used to? How many planets worth of material would be required if everyone on Earth consumed the same resources as someone living in a different part of the world, such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, the Philippines, or China? Which of the activities that you participate in every day consume these things: energy, food, or water? These are known as ecological footprint questions, and we'll cover these in more detail in many chapters throughout the book. How do you consume energy? As an average person living in the US, how much energy do they consume each day? How do we measure energy, and what are the units that we use to quantify the energy that's used? How much food do we use? How much water do we use? And what are the things that we can measure to determine if the water quality is safe for drinking, fishing, and recreation? And lastly, but not least, how do you think kids born 50 years from now, should they have access to the same resources you have access to today? One of the key concepts in sustainability is just simply, what's the capacity of the planet? And is there enough material on planet Earth to provide for the lifestyles of people living today and lifestyles of people that we would like to have in the future? This concept of providing for people today as well as in the future is a concept known as intergenerational equity. We can begin to try and measure these things by breaking down planet resources into different components. The US EPA uses an ecological footprint that's broken down into materials and waste, energy consumption, air and atmospheric resources, water resources, land, and ecosystem resources. We can roughly translate this to the way we use things today, such as energy might come from electricity, air conditioning, transportation. Food, clothing, and shelter make up material, waste, land, and ecosystem resources. And drinking water, showering, laundry, or water uses. Another commonly used ecological footprint is this one, and we'll go through this calculation in more detail as well. Again, we can see the ecological footprint broken down into carbon emissions, which might correlate with electricity, forest emissions or use, grazing lands, fishing grounds, built-up land, which may consume air conditioning, cropland. Transportation, again, might be a carbon emission source. Cropland, forestry, fishing grounds, grazing land, built-up land is going to function into what we eat, what we wear, and where we live. And of course, water use may be factored into this equation as well. In this chapter, we'll be calculating your personal ecological footprint. In order to do this, you'll need to consider how much food you eat each day. You might also want to consider where it comes from. You'll need to consider how much water you use each day, and what things we can measure to determine whether the water is safe or not. We'll also need to give some consideration to how much energy you use and what are the units that are used to measure and report the energy use and cost of energy. So you might want to start by writing down how much food you used over the previous 2 days. How much do you eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks? If you have the opportunity, you compare your food list with 2 other people, perhaps in a dorm room, your office, or sitting nearby. You want to think about the units of food consumption. So what's the weight of the food that you used? Was it packaged? Where was the food made and how did it get to you? And how much water did it take to make that food? As we begin to consider these questions and measure these quantitatively for people living in many different areas, we can calculate the ecological footprint. The ecological footprint is one measure or index that's used to determine environmental sustainability. The United Nations developed a set of Millennium Development Goals. Goal number 7 is to ensure environmental sustainability targets, to integrate the principles of sustainable development into policies and programs that reverse the loss of environmental resources. The goal is also to reduce biodiversity loss, maintaining the biodiversity that we have, to provide people with adequate access to safe drinking water and sanitation, and reduce the number of people with inadequate housing and shelter. Ways we might measure this are looking at the land area covered by forests, looking at carbon dioxide emissions, evaluating consumption, production, and use of ozone-depleting substances, measuring things like fish stocks, water resources, marine areas, and measuring the extinction rate of various species. We might measure the proportion of people with access to water and sanitation, and measure the portion of people living without adequate shelter and other resources. Since 1992, other international agreements have come into place since then to try and measure and maintain environmental sustainability. The Copenhagen Accord in 2009 recognized the need to specifically emission targets for carbon dioxide and decrease carbon dioxide in hopes that the global temperature change due to climate change from the increasing carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in our atmosphere would remain below 2 degrees Celsius. We'll come back and discuss this goal in much more detail in Chapter 6. But for now, it's sufficient to know that many of these goals target how much resources are used, how they affect our natural world, including human health and biodiversity, and what happens when those resources are changed or depleted. The stressor of these resources is largely the change in total global population. We see since 1992 the global population has increased by 26%. In this figure, the change looks somewhat linear, but we can actually see historically that the change in population has increased at an exponential rate. We see population changes from 1992, the actual growth rate is beginning to decline. But if we go back 5,000 years, we see this inflection point around the Industrial Revolution where we went from a low, slow growth period to a period of very, very rapid growth over a very short period of time. This is known as an exponential change, and we'll talk about that in more detail in an upcoming lecture. That rapid change changes the way we emit things into the environment, such as carbon dioxide, along with other resources. So our question is, if we are to achieve sustainability while also achieving development, how do we do this? Well, more people demand more resources. This is the key question when we discuss sustainability, and there is no simple and easy answer, which is why we'll talk about this question will be the theme throughout the rest of this book and course.